In the heart of a small dusty town nestled between rolling hills and endless highways, excitement buzzed through the air. It was the weekend of the annual biker festival, a time when leather-clad riders from all over the country descended upon the sleepy little community to celebrate freedom, camaraderie, and roaring engines. The streets were alive with the sound of revving motorcycles, laughter, and music spilling out of open windows. Amidst this whirlwind of energy walked Ronda Rousey, her presence calm yet commanding. Ronda had come to the festival not as a spectator but as a speaker. She was scheduled to deliver a keynote address at the local community center later that evening about resilience, self-worth, and finding strength in adversity. Her journey, from being one of the toughest fighters in the world to becoming an advocate for mental toughness, had inspired millions. But today she wasn't wearing boxing gloves or a championship belt. Instead, she wore a simple black skirt paired with sturdy boots, her hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another visitor enjoying the festivities. As Ronda strolled down the main street lined with food stalls, craft vendors, and rows of parked motorcycles gleaming under the sun, she couldn't help but smile. The atmosphere was infectious, people laughing, kids running around, bikers exchanging stories. For someone who thrived on challenges both inside and outside the ring, it felt refreshing to see people united by something so joyful. But not everyone shared her peaceful intentions. At the edge of the crowd, a group of rowdy bikers lounged, near their bikes, beers in hand. They were loud, boisterous, and clearly enjoying themselves. Their leader, a burly man named Jake with tattoos snaking up his arms and a grin that never seemed to fade, spotted Ronda walking past them. He nudged his friends and tilted his head toward her. "Check her out," he said, chuckling. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The others turned their attention to Ronda, sizing her up. One of them smirked, pointing at her skirt. "What's this? A skirt at a biker fest? Gotta be brave to pull that off." Another chimed in. "Yeah, maybe we should give her a warm welcome." The men laughed, their voices carrying across the street. While most of the jokes were harmless banter among friends, Jake decided to take things further. With a mischievous glint in his eye, he leaned forward and called out, "Hey, miss, you sure you're dressed right for this crowd?" Ronda stopped mid-step, turning slightly to glance at the group. She raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "I think I'm doing just fine," she replied coolly before continuing on her way. Her tone carried confidence without arrogance, leaving Jake momentarily speechless. Emboldened by his friend's laughter, however, he quickly recovered. "Oh, come on," he shouted after her. "Don't tell me you're scared to show us what you've got." It was meant to be playful teasing, the kind of harmless prank these guys often pulled on tourists or newcomers. But none of them realized they were dealing with someone far more formidable than they imagined. As Ronda disappeared into the bustling crowd, Jake shrugged, still grinning. "Guess we'll have to find out ourselves," he muttered under his breath, unaware of the storm brewing ahead. Little did they know, this encounter would become much more than a silly joke. For Ronda, it wasn't about proving herself, it was about teaching a lesson. And sometimes lessons came in ways no one expected. The laughter from Jake and his group echoed down the street, blending with the hum of the festival. Ronda's step slowed for a moment as she processed what had just happened. She could feel their eyes on her back, their amusement tinged with mockery. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her because of how she looked or dressed, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But this wasn't about anger. It was about opportunity. Ronda took a deep breath, letting the tension in her shoulders ease. Her mind raced not with frustration but with clarity. These men thought they were harmless pranksters, tossing out jokes without considering the impact. They didn't know who she was, or perhaps more importantly, what she stood for. Resilience, respect, and self-worth weren't just words she spoke during speeches. They were principles she lived by every day. And if there was ever a chance to demonstrate those values in action, this was it. She turned around slowly, her movements deliberate, her piercing gaze locked onto Jake and his friends, who were still lounging near their bikes. The smirk on Jake's face faltered slightly when he saw her approaching. He hadn't expected her to confront them, not after their little stunt. Hey," he said awkwardly. raising his beer bottle in an almost apologetic gesture. Just having some fun, you know? Fun? Ronda repeated, her voice steady but firm. She stopped a few feet away from the group, crossing her arms over her chest. You think lifting someone's skirt without permission is fun? Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his buddies for support. None of them spoke up. One of them cleared his throat nervously, while another avoided eye contact altogether. Their bravado seemed to evaporate under her unwavering stare. I'm here to talk about strength tonight, Ronda continued, her tone softening just enough to keep the conversation open. About finding courage even when people try to knock you down. But let me tell you something. I don't need to prove anything to anyone. What I do want is for you to understand why what you did isn't okay. Her words hung in the air, heavy, yet calm. The crowd milling around them began to notice the exchange. A few curious onlookers paused, craning their necks to see what was happening. Someone whispered, "Isn't that Ronda Rousey?" Another nodded, recognizing the former champion. Word spread quickly, drawing more attention to the scene unfolding. Before them, Jake scratched the back of his neck, suddenly looking like a kid caught red-handed. "Look, lady, we didn't mean no harm," he mumbled. "It was just a joke." "A joke?" Ronda asked, tilting her head slightly. There was no malice in her expression, just curiosity. "Do you think jokes can hurt people? Or make them feel small? Because trust me, I've been where you're standing right now. I've seen plenty of guys who think they're tough until they realize they're not." The weight of her words hit Jake hard. He swallowed, unsure of how to respond. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, realizing too late that they'd picked the wrong person to mess with. This wasn't just any woman. They were face to face with one of the strongest athletes in the world. But instead of lashing out or humiliating them, Ronda chose a different path. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only they could hear. "Here's the thing," she said. "I don't hold grudges. Everyone makes mistakes. But real strength comes from learning from those mistakes. So are you going to stand there acting tough, or are you willing to admit you crossed a line?" For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The festival sounds faded into the background as all eyes focused on the standoff. Finally, Jake set his beer bottle down and straightened up. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. "We messed up. Sorry." His apology was genuine, though tinged with embarrassment. Ronda nodded, accepting it without hesitation. "Apology accepted," she said simply. Then, with a faint smile, she added, "Now, how about showing me the rest of the festival? Maybe introduce me to some of your friends who actually deserve my time." The tension melted away. Instantly, laughter rippled through the growing crowd as Jake grinned sheepishly. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. Ronda shook it firmly, sealing the moment with grace and dignity. As she walked away with the group, now treating her with newfound respect, whispers rippled through the festival goers. Some clapped softly, others cheered, and many simply watched in awe. In that brief encounter, Ronda had done more than shut down a group of rowdy bikers. She had shown everyone present the power of kindness, confidence, and forgiveness. And somewhere, deep inside, Jake couldn't help but wonder if meeting Ronda Rousey might just change his life forever. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the festival, Ronda found herself walking alongside Jake and his group. The earlier tension had dissolved into an uneasy camaraderie, though the atmosphere was still tinged with curiosity. People who recognized her whispered excitedly to one another, pointing discreetly as she moved through the crowd. For Jake and his friends, it felt surreal. Moments ago, they were cracking jokes and acting tough, but now they were walking shoulder to shoulder with someone whose name carried weight far beyond their small town. Jake led the way, gesturing toward different stalls and attractions. "So, you like bikes?" he asked awkwardly, trying to break the silence. His attempt at casual conversation seemed forced, but Ronda appreciated the effort. "I respect them," she replied with a thoughtful smile. "They're powerful. Machines, just like people. It's all about how you handle them." Her response caught him off guard, making him pause mid-step. He glanced at her, unsure if she was referring to motorcycles or something deeper. Before he could ask, one of his friends chimed in, eager to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Hey, we've got this cool custom bike over here," he said, motioning toward a sleek motorcycle parked nearby. "Want to check it out?" Ronda nodded, following them to the bike. As they gathered around, admiring its polished chrome and intricate designs, she noticed how their demeanor had shifted. They weren't just showing off their prized possession. They were seeking approval, validation. Even these men who moments ago had been so full of bravado now seemed almost shy in her presence. "You know," Ronda began, leaning casually against the bike, "a lot of people think strength is about dominating others, being louder, bigger, or tougher than everyone else." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But real strength? That's about control. About knowing when to push forward and when to step back. It's about respecting boundaries, not just your own, but other people's too." The bikers exchanged glances, clearly struck by her insight. One of them, a wiry man named Pete, scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Guess we didn't think about that earlier," he admitted quietly. "We were just messing around, didn't mean no harm." "It's easy to get caught up in the moment," Ronda acknowledged, her tone gentle yet firm. "But every action has consequences. What seems like harmless fun to you might feel disrespectful or even hurtful to someone else. And that's where empathy comes in. You have to put yourself in someone else's shoes, even if it's just for a second." Her words resonated deeply, not just with Jake and his crew, but also with the growing number of onlookers who had stopped to listen. Some nodded in agreement while others murmured amongst themselves, reflecting on their own behaviors. Ronda wasn't just speaking to the bikers anymore. She was addressing anyone within earshot, turning what could have been an awkward confrontation into a teachable moment. Jake cleared his throat, visibly struggling with his emotions. "You ever think about teaching stuff like this full-time?" he asked, half joking but genuinely intrigued. "Like, I don't know, life lessons or something?" Ronda chuckled softly. "Funny you should say that. That's exactly why I'm here today, to share those kinds of lessons. Life gives us opportunities to learn, grow, and do better. Sometimes it takes a little nudge to see things differently." Her answer left Jake speechless. For years, he'd prided himself on being the toughest guy in the room, surrounded by people who admired his confidence and swagger. But standing next to Ronda, he realized there was a whole different kind of strength, one rooted in humility, self-awareness, and kindness. It was humbling yet inspiring. As the group continued exploring the festival together, Ronda encouraged them to open up about their lives. She learned that Jake had grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home until he found solace in the biker community. Pete confessed that he struggled with anxiety, using humor as a shield to hide his insecurities. Another member of the group admitted he felt lost after leaving the military, unsure of where he fit in anymore. Listening intently, Ronda shared stories of her own struggles, the injuries that nearly ended her career, the critics who doubted her abilities, and the moments when she questioned whether she was strong enough to keep going. "We all face challenges," she told them. "What matters isn't how hard you fall, it's how you pick yourself back up. And sometimes picking yourself up means asking for help." By the time evening fell, the festival lights twinkled, like stars above them. What had started as a tense encounter had transformed into something unexpected, a bond forged through honesty, vulnerability, and mutual respect. Jake and his friends weren't just seeing Ronda as a celebrity anymore. They saw her as a mentor, someone who challenged them to be better versions of themselves. And as Ronda prepared to leave for her keynote speech, Jake stepped forward, extending his hand once more. "Thanks," he said sincerely, "for everything." Shook his hand firmly, meeting his gaze with a warm smile. "Thank you," she replied, "for listening. That's the first step toward change." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a group of men and an entire town who would never forget the woman in the skirt who taught them the true meaning of strength. As Ronda made her way to the community center for her keynote, speech, she couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. What had started as an ordinary visit to a biker festival had turned into something extraordinary, a chance encounter that rippled outward, touching lives in ways she hadn't anticipated. She knew that moments like these were rare. They reminded her why she chose to share her story and inspire others. The community center buzzed with energy when she arrived. Rows of chairs filled the room, each one occupied by eager faces waiting to hear from the woman whose name had become synonymous with resilience and courage. From seasoned bikers who'd heard whispers of her earlier interaction to families curious about the former champion-turned-speaker, the audience was a diverse mix of people united by their desire to learn something new. Ronda stepped onto the stage, greeted by enthusiastic applause. She smiled warmly, taking a moment to scan the crowd. Her eyes landed briefly on Jake and his group, who had slipped into seats near the back. They looked out of place among the more polished attendees, their leather jackets standing out against the sea of casual attire. But there was no mistaking the sincerity in their expressions. They were here to listen. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Ronda began, her voice steady and clear. "I want to start by saying something important. Everyone has a story. Some are loud and bold, while others are quiet and hidden. But every single one of us is shaped by our experiences, our struggles, our victories, and everything in between." She paused, letting her words settle over the audience. Then she launched into her own journey, the highs and lows, the triumphs and setbacks. She spoke candidly about growing up in a world that often underestimated her because of her size or gender. About fighting, not just in the ring but in life, to prove that strength isn't defined by physical power alone, and about learning to embrace vulnerability as a source of strength rather than weakness. "But tonight," she continued, her tone shifting slightly, "I want to talk about something else. Something I experienced just a few hours ago." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as people exchanged curious glances. Jake and his friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they were about to become part of her speech. "I met a group of bikers today," Ronda said, her gaze drifting toward the back of the room. "At first glance, they seemed tough, confident, even cocky. And honestly, they tried to rattle me. But instead of reacting with anger, I saw an opportunity to teach, to connect, and to grow, not just for them, but for myself too." Jake sank lower in his seat, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't sure how much detail she would share, but he braced himself for whatever came next. "What happened between us wasn't just about respect," Ronda explained. "It was about understanding, about recognizing that we're all human, flawed, and imperfect. We make mistakes, yes, but it's what we do after those mistakes that defines us. Do we double down on bad behavior, or do we take responsibility and try to be better?" Her message resonated deeply with the audience. Parents nodded knowingly, thinking of their children. Young adults scribbled notes, inspired by her wisdom. Even the rowdiest members of the crowd sat silently, captivated by her authenticity. "And here's the thing," Ronda added, her voice softening. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. Every step forward matters, no matter how small. Whether it's apologizing for a careless comment or deciding to treat someone with kindness instead of judgment, those little choices add up. They create ripples that can change the world." By the time she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. People stood cheering not just for her accomplishments but for the hope she'd instilled in them. As Ronda stepped off the stage, she was immediately surrounded by well-wishers eager to thank her for her words. Among them was Jake, who pushed his way through the crowd to reach her. "Hey," he said, his voice barely audible over the noise. When Ronda turned to face him, he extended a piece of paper toward her. "This is, something I wrote, for you." She unfolded the note, reading the hastily scrawled words. "Thanks for showing me what real strength looks like. I'll never forget it." Beneath the message was a sketch of a motorcycle with wings, an unexpected symbol of transformation. Tears welled in Ronda's eyes as she looked at him. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "But thank you. This means more. Then you know. Jake shrugged, embarrassed but proud. We've got a long way to go, he admitted. But maybe we'll get there someday. With a final handshake, they parted ways. Two strangers whose paths had crossed briefly but left an indelible mark on each other's lives. As Rhonda watched Jake return to his friends, she realized the true impact of her day. It wasn't just about teaching lessons. It was about creating connections that would carry forward, inspiring others to pay it forward in turn. And somewhere deep inside, she knew the ripple effect had only just begun. The festival grounds had transformed as night fell. Strings of colorful lights illuminated the area, casting a warm glow over the bustling crowd. Music played softly in the background, blending with the hum of conversation and laughter. For Jake and his group, however, the evening felt different. Not just because of the vibrant atmosphere, but because of the shift within themselves. After leaving the community center, they wandered back to their usual spot near the row of motorcycles. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of grilled food and gasoline. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't often that any of them took time to reflect on their actions or consider how they affected others. But tonight Rhonda's words lingered like an unshakable echo, forcing them to confront truths they'd rather ignore. "You think she meant it?" Pete finally asked, breaking the quiet. He twirled a bottle cap between his fingers, avoiding eye contact. "About change being possible, I mean." Jake leaned back against his bike, staring up at the star-speckled sky. "Yeah, I think she did," he replied after a moment. "She didn't have to say all that stuff, or stick around after what we pulled. But she did. And you know why? Because she believes people can do better." His words hung in the air, heavy, yet hopeful. None of them spoke immediately, letting the idea sink in. Change wasn't easy. It never was. Especially for men like them who had spent years building reputations based on toughness and bravado. Admitting fault, showing vulnerability, or stepping outside their comfort zones felt almost unnatural. Yet something about Rhonda's unwavering belief in humanity had sparked a desire within them to try. Remember when she talked about empathy? Another member of the group, Chris, chimed in. His voice was hesitant, as though he feared saying the wrong thing. "About putting yourself in someone else's shoes? I've been thinking about that. Like, what if we flipped it around? What if someone did to us what we did to her?" The question made them pause. None of them liked to imagine themselves on the receiving end of such behavior. The thought of feeling disrespected or humiliated, even unintentionally, was unsettling. It forced them to see their earlier actions through a new lens, one that highlighted the impact rather than the intent. "I guess we owe her more than an apology," Jake said slowly, his tone thoughtful. "We owe her gratitude for not tearing into us when she could have, for treating us like human beings instead of idiots." Pete nodded, his expression softening. "And maybe we owe it to ourselves too. To stop acting like jerks just because everyone expects us to. Like, what's the point of being tough if it means hurting people along the way?" Their conversation continued late into the night, each man sharing pieces of himself he rarely revealed. Jake opened up about his childhood, the loneliness of moving from foster home to foster home, the longing for belonging that eventually led him to the biker community. Pete confessed how anxiety made him lash out sometimes, using humor, as a shield to hide his fears. Chris admitted he'd joined the group to escape feelings of failure after losing his job, hoping the camaraderie would fill the void left by disappointment. As they listened to one another, something remarkable happened. They began to see each other differently. No longer were they just a band of rough-and-tumble bikers bound by shared interests. They were individuals with stories, struggles, and dreams. Vulnerability brought them closer together, strengthening their bond in ways none of them anticipated. By the time the festival wound down, Jake stood up, brushing dirt off his jeans. "All right, listen up," he said, addressing the group. "We've got two choices here. We can go back to doing things the same old way, or we can start making changes. Small ones, sure, but still changes. Starting tomorrow, Let's show people. We're not just about noise and attitude. Let's prove we're worth respecting." The others exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. It wouldn't be easy. Breaking habits formed over years required effort and commitment, but they were willing to give it a shot. Inspired by Ronda's example, they decided to take the first step toward becoming better versions of themselves. Next morning, as the town began cleaning up after the festival, Jake and his friends approached the local organizers. They offered to help dismantle stalls, clear trash, and assist vendors packing up their goods. At first, the townsfolk were surprised. These were the same guys known for causing trouble, not lending a hand. But as the day went on, their sincerity won people over. Smiles replaced wary looks, and gratitude softened skeptical tones. Word spread quickly about the bikers' unexpected kindness. By noon, even the mayor stopped by to thank them personally. "You boys sure know how to make a comeback," he joked, clapping Jake on the shoulder. Jake grinned, though his smile carried a hint of humility. "Just trying to do better," he replied simply. For the first time in years, Jake and his friends felt proud, not of their reputation, but of the positive difference they were beginning to make. Little did they know their transformation was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one inspired by a single act of grace from a woman in a skirt. The days following the festival marked a turning point for Jake and his group. What had started as a fleeting encounter with Ronda Rousey had blossomed into something far greater, a commitment to change, not just for themselves, but for the community around them. Their decision to help clean up after the festival wasn't just about making amends. It was the first step toward rewriting their story. Word of their newfound dedication spread quickly through the small town. Neighbors who once avoided crossing paths with the rowdy bikers now greeted them warmly. Shopkeepers waved from behind counters, and children no longer ran away in fear when they revved their engines down the street. It was a subtle shift, but one that carried immense weight. For the first time, Jake and his friends felt seen, not as troublemakers, but as contributors, as people worth respecting. Encouraged by the positive response, they decided to keep going. Every weekend, they organized volunteer efforts, fixing broken fences at the local park, painting over graffiti on walls, and even planting trees along the main road. At first, their motivation stemmed from guilt, a desire to undo the harm they'd caused over the years. But as weeks turned into months, their actions became less about redemption and more about purpose. They discovered joy in helping others, a sense of fulfillment they'd never experienced before. One Saturday morning, while working on a community garden project, Jake spotted someone familiar walking toward them. It was Ronda. She had returned to the town for another speaking engagement and, upon hearing about the bikers' transformation, decided to pay them a visit. Her arrival sparked a mix of excitement and nervousness among the group. They weren't sure how she'd react, whether she'd see their efforts as genuine or merely an attempt to win approval. "Hey," Jake called out, wiping dirt from his hands as he approached her. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Ronda smiled, her eyes scanning the scene before her. "I heard rumors about some bikers turning over a new leaf," she said, her tone light but sincere. "Had to come see it for myself." Her words put the men at ease. They proudly showed her around the garden, explaining their plans to grow vegetables for local shelters and schools. Pete enthusiastically described how they'd learned to compost, while Chris pointed out the raised beds they'd built using recycled materials. Ronda listened intently, nodding occasionally and asking thoughtful questions. She could see the pride in their faces. The same men who had once teased her were now pouring their energy into creating something meaningful. "You've done good work here," Ronda said finally, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "But remember, this isn't just about what you're doing for others. It's also about what you're learning about yourselves." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Over the past few months, he'd come to realize that true strength wasn't about dominance or control. It was about growth. About becoming someone who could look in the mirror without shame. Someone who inspired others to do the same. Later that evening, during her speech at the community center, Ronda shared their story. She spoke candidly about meeting the bikers, the initial tension, and the profound impact of choosing empathy over judgment. When I told them they could change, I didn't just mean apologizing or cleaning up trash, she explained to the audience. I meant changing the way they saw themselves and the world around them. And guess what? They proved me right, the Kyo. Crowd erupted into applause, many turning to look at Jake and his group seated near the back. This time, instead of shrinking into their seats, they stood tall, accepting the recognition with quiet pride. It wasn't about seeking praise. It was about owning their journey and inspiring others to take similar steps. After the event, several townspeople approached the bikers, thanking them for their contributions and expressing admiration for their transformation. One elderly woman handed Jake a homemade pie, her eyes glistening with tears. "You boys remind me that people can always surprise you," she said softly. "Thank you for reminding us all that second chances matter." As the night drew to a close, Jake gathered his friends outside the community center. Under the glow of streetlights, they reflected on how far they'd come and how much further they wanted to go. "We've made progress," Jake admitted, his voice filled with determination. "But this is just the beginning. We've got a lot more work to do on ourselves, on this town, and maybe even beyond." The others nodded in agreement, their resolve stronger than ever. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Old habits die hard, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks along the way. But they also knew they weren't alone. Together, they had found a purpose bigger than themselves, one rooted in kindness, respect, and resilience. And somewhere deep inside, they knew that the ripple effect Ronda had started would continue to spread, touching lives far beyond their small town. Months turned into a year, and the small town that once buzzed with fleeting festival excitement had transformed into something remarkable. A community united by shared values of kindness, respect, and growth. Jake and his group of bikers were no longer seen as outcasts or troublemakers. They had become pillars of the town, leading initiatives that brought people together and inspired change. Their efforts didn't stop at local projects. Inspired by Ronda's message about creating ripples, they expanded their reach, organizing charity rides to raise funds for nearby communities in need. They partnered with schools to mentor at-risk youth, teaching them skills like bike repair and offering guidance on navigating life's challenges. The same men who once prided themselves on being untouchable now wore their vulnerability as a badge of honor, showing others that strength lies in embracing imperfection and striving to improve. One crisp autumn morning, the town hosted its annual Harvest Festival, an event that had grown significantly since Jake and his friends began volunteering. Stalls lined the streets, filled with fresh produce, handmade crafts, and baked goods. Children laughed as they ran between games and activities, while adults mingled, catching up over cups of hot cider. At the center of it all stood a stage, where speeches and performances took place throughout the day. Ronda returned to the town once again, this time invited not just as a guest, but as an honorary member of the community. When she arrived, she was greeted with cheers and hugs. Not just from Jake and his group, but from nearly everyone present. The impact she'd made was undeniable, her presence symbolizing the spark that ignited so much positive change. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the festival grounds, Ronda stepped onto the stage for the closing ceremony. The crowd fell silent, anticipation hanging thick in the air. She looked out at the sea of faces, familiar and new, and smiled warmly. "When I first came here," she began, her voice steady yet filled with emotion, "I never imagined how deeply this place would touch my heart. I thought I was coming to share lessons about resilience and self-worth. Instead, I learned even more than I gave." Her gaze drifted toward Jake and his group, who stood near the front, their expressions a mix of pride and gratitude. "These men taught me something powerful," she continued. "They reminded me that no one is beyond redemption, that every single person has the capacity to grow, to heal, and to inspire others. And they proved it, not through words but through action." The audience erupted into applause, many nodding in agreement. Tears glistened in the eyes of those who had witnessed the bikers' transformation firsthand. For the townspeople, It wasn't just about the physical changes, the cleaned-up parks, repaired buildings, or thriving gardens. It was about the shift in mindset, the renewed sense of hope and connection that rippled outward, touching everyone it encountered. Jake stepped forward, taking the microphone from Rhonda. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was strong. "A year ago we were lost," he admitted, his words raw and honest. "We thought we knew what strength was, but we were wrong. Strength isn't about being tough or invincible. It's about admitting when you're wrong, asking for help, and doing whatever it takes to make things right." He paused, glancing back at his friends before continuing. "Rhonda showed us that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. From listening, learning, and growing. And because of her, we've been able to pass that lesson on, to each other, to our families, and to this amazing community." The crowd cheered again, louder this time. As Jake handed the microphone back to Rhonda, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile radiant. "This is just the beginning," she said. "What you've built here isn't just a legacy, it's a blueprint, a reminder that compassion and courage can transform lives one step at a time." As the ceremony drew to a close, the townspeople gathered around the stage for a final group photo. Jake and his friend stood front and center, their arms draped over each other's shoulders. Behind them, Rhonda raised a fist in solidarity, her presence a testament to the power of human connection. That night, under a blanket of stars, Jake sat alone on his motorcycle, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the woman in the skirt who had challenged him to be better, not through anger but through understanding. About the friendships he'd strengthened and the lives he'd touched. Most of all, he thought about the future. A future full of possibilities driven by the belief that change starts with a single choice. And as he revved his engine and rode off into the night, he carried with him not just the memory of what they'd achieved, but the promise of what was still to come. Because the ripple effect, once set in motion, could never truly end.